The story is usually told as if it happened in one impossible burst. One American Marine, dozens of Japanese defenders. 7 minutes of violence so concentrated that it feels less like history and more like something pulled from legend. But on Peleliu, legends did not rise from clean heroics. They rose from heat, coral, fear, smoke, confusion, and men being forced into choices no human being should ever have to make. It was September 18th, 1944. The island was small enough to disappear on a wall map, but large enough to swallow regiments. From the air, Peleliu looked like another coral island in the western Pacific, ringed by reef and beach, marked by an airfield, covered in scrub, rock, and broken jungle. From the ground, it felt like a furnace built for killing. The Marines had already learned that the island was not going to fall the way many commanders had imagined. The Japanese were not simply waiting on the beaches to be smashed by naval guns. They were deeper inside the island now, hidden in caves, trenches, pillboxes, and coral ridges. They had turned Peleliu into a defensive machine. And on that day, one part of that machine stopped a Marine platoon cold. Japanese fire came from positions that were difficult to see and harder to silence. Machine guns snapped across open ground. Rifle shots cracked from concealed slits. Explosions punched dust and coral fragments into the air. The Marines could feel the enemy more clearly than they could see him. Every movement forward invited fire. Every pause gave the Japanese more time to aim. Men pressed themselves against the ground. Coral cut through clothing and scraped skin raw. The heat did not simply hang in the air. It sat on the body like weight. Sweat ran into the eyes. Weapons grew hot in the hands. The air smelled of burned powder, white dust, oil, blood, and the sour fear of men who knew they had entered a place where every yard had been prepared in advance. Somewhere in that pin line was Private First Class Arthur J. Jackson. He was not a symbol yet. He was not a citation. He was not a story that would be retold decades later. He was a young Marine in a deadly situation, surrounded by men who needed the line to move and by enemy positions designed to make movement impossible. The Japanese defenders believed their fortified position could not be broken by one man. That belief was not foolish. It was built into the very design of the battlefield. A pillbox was not just a hole in the ground. It was concrete, coral, logs, earth, and discipline. It was a place where men could fire outward while remaining shielded from return fire. It was meant to make courage irrelevant. It was meant to turn attacking soldiers into targets. And from the Japanese point of view, the logic seemed sound. If the Marines advanced, they would be shot. If they stayed still, they would remain trapped. If they tried to flank one position, another would catch them from the side. If they brought up explosives, the men carrying them might be killed before they got close enough. That was what the defenders believed. What actually happened was more violent, more chaotic, and far more costly than the legend suggests. Because Jackson moved. Try to imagine the first few seconds. Not the whole attack. Not the later number of pillboxes. Not the medal. Just the moment when a man rises from the ground while other men are trying to become part of it. The human body understands danger faster than the mind can explain it. Every instinct says to stay low. Every burst of enemy fire confirms the instinct. But Jackson moved forward anyway. There is a strange silence inside such a decision. Around him, the battlefield was noise. Weapons, shouts, impacts, the heavy cough of explosions. But inside the decision, there was only distance. The distance to the first bunker. The distance to the opening. The distance between being pinned down and being close enough to kill or be killed. That is where the myth begins. Not because one man killed dozens in a clean, heroic sequence. Not because war suddenly became simple. But because on a battlefield designed to stop units, one Marine chose to close the distance alone. And once he began moving, the enemy's belief began to crack. To understand why one Marine had to move alone, we have to go back to the island itself, and to the deadly mistake both sides made before the battle even began. Before Peleliu became a nightmare, it was a plan. On maps and planning rooms, it had shape, scale, beaches, objectives, and timelines. The island sat in the Palau Group, part of the wider American advance across the Pacific toward the Philippines. Its airfield mattered. Its position mattered. Its capture seemed to fit the rhythm of the war as American forces pushed westward, island by island, airfield by airfield, closer to Japan. From a distance, that rhythm could create an illusion. The United States had learned how to move enormous power across the ocean. Battleships, cruisers, carriers, landing craft, tanks, artillery, aircraft, engineers, marines, soldiers. An entire industrial nation had learned how to arrive at an island and bring war with it. So before the landings, Peleliu was bombarded. Naval guns hammered the island. Aircraft dropped bombs. Smoke rose from the target areas. To men watching from offshore, it seemed possible that much of the Japanese defense had already been broken before the first wave reached the beach. This was one of the beliefs. The Americans believed that overwhelming firepower could prepare the way. They believed the island could be taken quickly. Some expected Peleliu to fall in only a few days. General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, famously expected a hard but short fight, a quickie, rough but fast. But Peleliu did not obey the language of planning rooms. The National World War II Museum notes that many planners expected 3 or 4 days. They were wrong. The Japanese had changed. Earlier in the Pacific War, Japanese defenders had often concentrated heavily near beaches, meeting amphibious landings with direct resistance. But by 1944, after brutal defeats on other islands, Japanese commanders were learning a harder lesson. If they fought too close to the beach, American naval gunfire and air power could destroy them early. If they survived deeper inland, hidden in terrain that protected them, they could force the Americans into a long, exhausting, intimate battle. Peleliu was perfect for that kind of defense. This was not the soft green island that might appear in imagination. It was coral, ridges, jagged rock, caves, scrub, and open killing ground. Coral was not just uncomfortable. It shaped the battle. It cut men. It shattered into fragments. It made digging difficult. It reflected heat. It turned every fall into injury and every exposed movement into punishment. The Japanese understood this terrain. They did not need to defeat American firepower in the open. They only needed to survive it underground or behind cover, then emerge when the Marines came close. They built pillboxes and gun positions. They connected firing points. They used caves, trenches, and natural ridges. They placed weapons to cover approaches from multiple directions. They created zones where an attacking Marine might believe he had found cover, only to discover that another position could reach him from the side. This was defense in depth. It was patient. It was cruel. It was designed not merely to hold ground, but to consume the men trying to take it. When the Marines landed on September 15th, the island began revealing the difference between what was believed and what was real. The beaches were not simply scenes of cinematic assault. They were places where landing vehicles were hit, units became separated, communication faltered, and men tried to move through fire toward objectives that looked closer on maps than they felt under enemy guns. According to Marine Corps accounts, the battle lasted more than 2 months, and the 1st Marine Division suffered heavy casualties, including roughly 1,300 killed and 5,450 wounded. The airfield was taken, but taking ground did not mean controlling the island. Peleliu resisted in pieces. A ridge here, a cave there, a bunker line, a pocket, a hidden gun, a trench, a ravine. A slope that looked empty until it erupted. For the Marines, time began to change shape. The war was no longer measured in miles, not even in objectives. It was measured in yards, sometimes in feet, sometimes in the distance between one shell hole and the next. For the Japanese, The plan was working in its own terrible way. They had chosen not to waste themselves in a single dramatic defense at the shoreline. They would make the Americans come in close. They would make every position a small battle. They would make the island itself a weapon. That is what both sides misunderstood in different ways. The Americans underestimated how much punishment a buried enemy could survive. The Japanese underestimated what desperate Marines would do when trapped between mission and death. And somewhere in the southern part of the island, those two misunderstandings were moving toward a single point. A fortified pocket where Arthur Jackson's platoon would be stopped, and where the idea of a bunker as safety would be tested at close range. But the deadliest danger on Peleliu was not the island itself. It was the assumption that courage and firepower alone could easily crush what the Japanese had built underground. A bunker is easy to misunderstand if you imagine it from the outside. To someone far from the battle, it may seem like a target, a fixed point, something to be located, hit, and destroyed. Put enough fire on it, and it disappears. Bring up a tank, an explosive charge, a flamethrower, a grenade, and the problem is solved. But on Peleliu, a bunker was not merely a target. It was part of a system. One Japanese pillbox could stop a squad. Another could cover the first. A trench line could feed defenders into a position that seemed already neutralized. A cave entrance could disappear behind brush and coral, only to open into a larger underground space. A machine gun could remain silent until Marines were close enough that every burst counted. This was the first great false assumption, that a bunker was just a bunker. In reality, a bunker was a decision made in advance. It represented the choice of a commander who had studied the terrain and decided where men would die. It was positioned to shape movement. It was angled to catch attackers when they crossed exposed ground. It was concealed to delay detection. It was protected so that ordinary rifle fire could not easily silence it. And most importantly, it existed in relationship to other positions. That was what made Peleliu so punishing. The Marines were not facing isolated obstacles. They were facing a defensive body. Touch one part, and another reacted. Move against one gun, and another gun opened. Try to rescue a wounded man, and the same ground became a trap. On September 18th, Jackson's platoon was caught in exactly that kind of trap. His unit, Company I, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, was fighting in the southern sector of the island. His Medal of Honor record states that his platoon's left flank advance was held up by Japanese troops concealed in strongly fortified positions. Those words are clean on a page. Held up, concealed, fortified. But on the ground, they meant something else. Held up meant men could not move without being hit. Concealed meant the enemy could kill from places the Marines could not immediately identify. Fortified meant the enemy could survive the kind of return fire that might have stopped ordinary infantry in the open. The platoon was not stopped by lack of courage. It was stopped by geometry, preparation, and fire. Japanese positions controlled the approaches. The Marines were forced into the worst kind of combat, close enough to be under accurate fire, but not close enough to destroy the source of it. This is where command begins to narrow. In a planning room, officers can speak of maneuver. On the ground, maneuver may become a few men crawling through dust while bullets pass inches overhead. Orders become gestures. Timelines collapse. The battlefield shrinks until all that matters is the nearest source of fire and whether anyone can reach it. Fear in such moments is not theatrical. It is practical. A Marine does not need to imagine death. He can see what exposure does. He can see a man fall. He can hear the change in a voice when someone is hit. He can feel the pressure of waiting while the enemy remains untouched. The Japanese defenders knew this pressure. Their position was built to produce it. They did not need to rush. They did not need to show themselves. They only needed to hold long enough for American momentum to die. That is the hidden power of a fortified position. It does not merely kill bodies. It kills tempo. It makes an attacking unit stop thinking like a unit and start thinking like separate men trying to survive. It turns initiative into hesitation. The Marines could call for fire. They could try to shift angle. They could wait for support. But every minute pinned down carried a cost. Wounded men might bleed. Ammunition might be spent. Heat might drain strength. The enemy might adjust. Other parts of the line might stall because this flank could not move. Then comes the pressure that no map can show, the knowledge that someone may have to go first. Someone may have to close the distance. Someone may have to move into the gap between what the unit needs and what survival allows. That was the space Arthur Jackson entered. The Japanese believed their fortifications had turned the battlefield into a controlled problem. They believed American movement could be stopped, channeled, punished, and broken. In that belief, they were not wrong. For a time, the line did stop. But battlefield reality often changes through a single human act that no defensive plan can fully predict. Then, in a moment that should have ended in death, a young automatic rifleman made the kind of decision no battle plan can predict. Arthur Jackson was not supposed to become the center of the battle. Most men who become symbols do not wake up that morning as symbols. They wake up tired. They check their weapon. They move when told. They try not to think too far ahead because the next hour is already too much. Jackson was a Marine rifleman, young and under pressure, serving in a unit that had already been pulled into the brutal reality of Peleliu. He was not standing outside history, looking at the scene with the confidence of hindsight. He was inside it, where judgment had to happen quickly and fear had to be carried rather than conquered. His weapon mattered. As an automatic rifleman, he could deliver a kind of mobile firepower that ordinary riflemen could not. But a weapon alone does not explain what happened. Plenty of men carried powerful weapons on Peleliu. The difference was the decision to use it at the closest and most dangerous range. The first movement forward may have been the most important moment of the entire action. Because before the grenades, before the demolition charges, before the destruction of pillboxes, there was a choice to rise and advance while Japanese fire was still active. That choice changed the shape of the battlefield. From the Japanese position, the Americans had been pinned. That was the point. The defenders were protected. The openings of the pillboxes were dangerous to approach. The fire lanes were working. The Marine advance had been interrupted. If the defenders could hold their nerve, the logic of the position would continue to hold. Then one Marine began to move through that logic. Jackson did not make the bunker weak from a distance. He made it vulnerable by getting close. This is the brutal paradox of fortified combat. A bunker is strongest when the attacker remains in front of it at the distance it was designed to dominate. It is weakest when an attacker reaches the opening, the blind spot, the flank, or the roof. At that range, the defender's protection can become confinement. The same walls that shielded him from artillery can trap him against fire, smoke, flame, and explosive force. But reaching that range is the nightmare. Imagine the ground. Broken coral, dust, heat, scattered equipment, the bodies of men who had tried to move before. There is no smooth path, no clean heroic sprint. Every step is unstable. Every pause is dangerous. If he crawls, he is slow. If he runs, he is exposed. If he stops, he may never start again. The Marines behind him could provide limited covering fire, but cover on Peleliu was rarely complete. Japanese weapons were not coming from one obvious direction. They were harassing him from multiple points. The Medal of Honor citation later described him advancing under continuous fire from other hostile emplacements, covered only by small rifle parties. That detail matters. He was not fighting in a silent corridor. He was moving through a live defensive pocket. Even if one bunker was his immediate target, other positions could see or sense his movement. The enemy did not need to hit him cleanly at first. They could force him down. They could slow him. They could make him use ammunition. They could make the attack collapse before it began. Jackson kept going. There must have been a moment when the bunker opening came into reach. Not safe reach. Never safe. but close enough that his automatic fire could be poured directly into the aperture. Close enough that the men inside were no longer abstract enemy soldiers behind a position. They were occupants of a sealed place. He fired into the opening, not just to kill, but to trap, to make the defenders keep their heads down, to deny them the chance to shoot accurately, to create the few seconds needed for grenades and explosive charges. War at that distance becomes mechanical and intimate at once. Hands move before thoughts can fully form. A magazine, a grenade, a charge, a shouted warning, smoke, blast, dust, heat. The terrible pressure wave of an explosion in enclosed space. The Japanese believed the bunker protected them. Jackson's approach turned it into a chamber. This does not make the act simple. It makes it more terrifying. Because once the first position was hit, the battlefield did not end. It widened. Other positions remained. Other weapons fired. The destruction of one bunker opened the possibility of movement, but it also announced Jackson as a target. He had broken the stillness. He had disrupted the pocket. Now every Japanese gun that could reach him had reason to try. What happened next was not a clean duel. It was a brutal sequence of fire, explosives, smoke, and instinct, one bunker at a time. P4. The first large pillbox was the center of the moment. According to the official citation, Jackson charged a large pillbox housing approximately 35 enemy soldiers. That number alone tells us what the position represented. This was not a lonely rifleman in a hole. It was a fortified installation packed with defenders, built to hold, built to kill, and built to stop the Marine advance on that flank. Jackson came at it under fire. He poured automatic fire into the opening. The purpose was immediate and ruthless: trap the defenders inside. Keep them from using the aperture. Keep them from returning controlled fire. Keep them from recovering the confidence that their fortification had given them. Then came white phosphorus grenades and explosive charges, brought up by a fellow Marine. The action was not magic. It required coordination under extreme pressure. Someone had to get the charges forward. Someone had to risk crossing ground already being watched. Someone had to trust that Jackson's fire would keep the defenders suppressed long enough. White phosphorus was a terrifying weapon in enclosed spaces. It produced smoke, heat, burning fragments, and panic. In the Pacific, where caves and bunkers turned the war into close assault, such weapons became part of the grim toolkit of survival. Nobody who used them could pretend war remained clean. Nobody trapped by them could mistake the meaning of being sealed inside a position. The pillbox was demolished. The enemy inside was killed. But this was not the end of the action. A lesser story would stop there. It would freeze the frame, name the hero, and move on. But Peleliu did not allow clean endings. The destruction of one position revealed the next. Jackson advanced alone under continuous fire and used similar methods to smash two smaller positions nearby. The battlefield became a sequence of deadly problems, each one requiring him to repeat the most dangerous part of the first assault: closing distance. Think of what that repetition means. The first charge might be explained by adrenaline. The second demands something else. The third demands even more. Each new position gives fear another chance to take control. Each explosion drains strength. Each burst of enemy fire reminds the attacker that luck has limits. The body begins to understand what the mind refuses to calculate. Yet Jackson kept moving. He stormed one gun position after another. The official account credits him with wiping out a total of 12 pillboxes and about 50 Japanese soldiers. This is where the title's legend lives. Some retellings compress the violence into minutes and sharpen the numbers into something almost impossible to believe. But even the documented version is staggering enough. 12 fortified positions, around 50 enemy soldiers, one Marine at the center of a collapsing pocket of resistance. The important thing is not only the number. The important thing is the transformation of belief. For the Japanese defenders, each pillbox had been a promise. It promised protection. It promised control over the approach. It promised that American infantry would be forced to pay a heavy price for every yard. It promised that hidden positions could turn courage into casualties. Jackson broke that promise by attacking the bunker at the point where its design became vulnerable. For the Marines behind him, the effect must have been almost unreal. A line that had been pinned began to see movement again. A position that had seemed untouchable was suddenly smoking, shattered, silent. Then another. Then another. Fear did not vanish, but it changed direction. The impossible had become something a man was doing in front of them. Still, this cannot be turned into a simple celebration. Every destroyed pillbox meant men died in confined spaces. Every yard gained was paid for by terror on both sides. The Japanese soldiers inside those positions had been ordered to hold, and in many cases they had no realistic path of escape. The Marines outside had to destroy them because leaving them alive meant more Marines would die. This was the moral brutality of Peleliu. The battle reduced survival to actions that would haunt any honest witness. The sounds would have been overwhelming. Automatic fire hammering at close range. Grenades detonating. Charges blasting coral and timber. Japanese weapons firing from nearby positions. Men shouting warnings that may or may not have been heard. The flat crack of rifles. The deeper thud of explosions. The hiss and burn of smoke. The strange pauses after a position fell, when everyone waited to see whether it was truly silent. Jackson was not moving through a movie scene. He was moving through a machine built to kill him. And somehow, he kept taking it apart. By the time the assault had run its course, the platoon's left flank movement had been restored, and the Japanese pocket in that sector had been dealt a devastating blow. The action would later become a Medal of Honor citation. But on the day it happened, it was not a citation. It was a young Marine, a weapon, grenades, charges, and the refusal to let a fortified line keep strangling his unit. But Jackson's attack did more than destroy positions. It changed what the Marines around him believed was possible and what the Japanese defenders could no longer assume. Defensive systems depend on more than walls. They depend on confidence. A pillbox is strongest when the men inside believe the attacker cannot reach them. A trench line is strongest when each point trusts the next. A pocket of resistance survives when its defenders believe the system still works. Jackson's assault attacked that belief. Once one pillbox fell, the positions around it were no longer part of an unbroken wall. They were exposed pieces of a damaged structure. The flank that had been stopped began to move. The Japanese defenders could no longer assume that their openings, fields of fire, and concealed approaches would protect them from close assault. The fight had become unstable. This is one of the most important truths of small unit combat. A single local action can have effects larger than its physical size. On a map, 12 pillboxes may seem small. On Peleliu, they could decide whether a platoon moved or remained trapped. They could decide whether wounded men could be reached. They could decide whether a pocket survived long enough to continue killing. They could decide whether commanders had options or only casualties. Jackson's one-man assault contributed essentially to the destruction of the enemy in the southern sector, according to the official Medal of Honor citation. But the collapse of certainty was not clean. Japanese resistance on Peleliu did not evaporate because one Marine performed an extraordinary action. The island was too hard, the defensive system too deep, and the Japanese commitment too severe for that. Peleliu continued to demand more men, more fire, more exhaustion, more blood. The southern pocket was only one part of the island's nightmare. Still, within that part, something had changed. The Marines who had been pinned now had a way forward. Officers could reassess. Riflemen could move. Wounded men who had been unreachable might now be recovered. Units that had been under pressure could regain momentum. That is what an assault like Jackson's does. It does not win the war by itself. It releases men from a tactical prison. For the Japanese defenders, the psychological effect would have been different. Their doctrine had demanded endurance. Their positions had been built for attrition. But when a fortified line begins to be broken from close range, fear becomes immediate. The enemy is no longer a distant force advancing across open ground. He is at the opening. He is above the entrance. He is close enough to throw fire and explosives into the place where you thought you were protected. That kind of realization changes the air inside a bunker. Outside, the Marines had feared the hidden gun. Inside, the Japanese now had to fear the approaching man. This is the collision at the heart of Warfront Archive's identity. What they believed, that the fortified pocket would slow, channel, and bleed the attackers. What really happened? The pocket's own design became vulnerable once one Marine closed the distance and began breaking it apart from within its blind spots. But there is a danger in telling the story this way. It can make war sound like a contest between courage and fortification, with courage winning in the end. That is too simple. Peleliu punishes simple explanations. The Americans did not win because the battle was easy. They won because they were willing, and often forced, to pay costs that would be hard to justify afterward. The Japanese did not lose because they lacked courage. Many fought with grim discipline from positions that were nearly impossible to reduce without close assault. The island became a place where bravery existed everywhere, but mercy was almost nowhere. Command failure also shadows the story. Peleliu was controversial because many later questioned whether the island needed to be taken at such cost. The airfield's strategic value was debated. The battle lasted far longer and cost far more than early expectations suggested. The 1st Marine Division was badly mauled and would not fight again until Okinawa. That wider failure makes Jackson's action more powerful, not less. Because individual heroism often appears brightest where planning has failed. When commanders underestimate terrain, when intelligence fails to reveal the true depth of defenses, when timelines collapse and support cannot solve the immediate problem, the burden descends onto the men closest to the fire. Jackson's assault was extraordinary, but it happened inside a battle where extraordinary acts became necessary because the ordinary assumptions had broken down. That is the tragedy beneath the metal. A young Marine did not move forward because war had become noble. He moved because the line was stopped. Men were in danger, and the enemy position had to be destroyed. His courage was real. The necessity that demanded it was terrible. Yet the danger of stories like this is that they can make war sound simple. One brave man, one impossible fight, one victory. Peleliu was not simple. After the noise fades, battlefields do not become quiet all at once. They settle. Dust drifts back down. Smoke thins. Men begin to hear smaller sounds again. Someone calling for a corpsman, a weapon being checked, the scrape of boots over coral, the weak voice of a wounded man asking for water. A place that moments earlier seemed to be made only of explosions returns to human scale, and that is often when the cost becomes visible. Peleliu's cost was everywhere. The heat alone punished the living. Marines fought in temperatures that felt unbearable, with water supply problems that made thirst another enemy. Coral turret bodies. The wounded suffered on ground too, exposed for easy rescue. Dead men could remain where they fell because moving toward them meant creating more casualties. The island did not allow grief to happen properly. Men had to step around it, fight through it, and carry it later. This is why the story of Arthur Jackson must be told carefully. It is easy to say he killed dozens. It is harder to sit with what that means. It means confined spaces filled with smoke and fire. It means young Japanese soldiers dying inside positions they had been ordered to defend. It means young Marines watching one of their own do something almost impossible because the alternative was more Marines being cut down. It means survival became tied to destruction at arm's length. Heroism in such a place is not clean. It is courage under moral pressure. It is action taken when every option is terrible. Jackson survived. That fact alone is astonishing. Many men on Peleliu did not. He would later receive the Medal of Honor, the highest American military decoration, for his actions on September 18, 1944. But a medal does not erase the battlefield. The citation records what was done. It cannot fully record the sound, the fear, the heat, the faces of the men around him, or the private memories that follow a person long after the public ceremony ends. It cannot contain the entire weight of what it means to be 19 years old and move through fire toward men trying to kill you, then live long enough for others to call it history. The Defense Department profile of Jackson notes that he later described himself as unbelievably lucky. That sentence matters because it brings the story back down from legend. Men who survive combat often understand luck in a way civilians cannot. Luck is not modesty. It is memory. It is knowing that another man did not survive the same kind of fire. It is knowing that a bullet inches one way or another would have changed everything. It is knowing that courage and survival are not the same thing. The legend says one American killed them all in 7 minutes. The reality is heavier. The reality is that a young Marine attacked because his platoon was pinned down. The reality is that Japanese defenders had built a position strong enough to stop movement and deadly enough to force an impossible answer. The reality is that Jackson's actions saved lives and took lives. The reality is that the battle around him continued to grind men down. Peleliu became one of the most bitterly remembered battles of the Pacific. Not because it was the largest, not because it was the most famous, but because it seemed to compress the war's hardest truths into one island. Confidence turning into shock, firepower meeting terrain, planning meeting resistance, courage meeting attrition. For the Marines, Peleliu taught that even overwhelming strength could be slowed by hidden defenders who understood the ground. For the Japanese, it showed that even the strongest prepared positions could be cracked when attackers were willing to come close enough. For the men on both sides, it proved something more personal and more terrible, that the human body was often the final instrument used to solve problems created by commanders, maps, and assumptions. The emotional weight of Jackson's story does not come from the number of enemies killed. It comes from the contradiction. One man's courage can be inspiring. The situation that required it can be horrifying. That is the tension a serious documentary must hold. If we only celebrate, we flatten the truth. If we only mourn, we miss the courage. Peleliu demands both. So when we look back at Arthur Jackson, we should not see only the impossible assault. We should see the pinned Marines behind him. We should see the Japanese soldiers inside the fortified positions. We should see the island that made distance deadly and shelter temporary. We should see a battle where belief collided with reality so violently that a 19-year-old had to carry the answer forward in his own hands. And that is why the story survives. Not because it was clean, not because it was easy, but because it reveals the terrifying distance between what soldiers believed war would be and what it actually became. At the beginning, there were beliefs. The Americans believed Peleliu could be taken quickly. They believed bombardment, planning, amphibious power, and marine aggression could break the island in days. They had reason to believe it. By 1944, the United States had become a force of almost unimaginable reach. It could move armies across oceans, put aircraft over distant islands, and bring naval guns close enough to shake the earth. The Japanese believed something else. They believed the old way of meeting Americans at the beach had become too costly. They believed survival inland could turn American strength against itself. They believed caves, ridges, pillboxes, and fire discipline could make the Marines pay for every yard. They believed that if they could not stop the American advance across the Pacific, they could at least make it bleed. Arthur Jackson may have believed only what the moment allowed him to believe. That his platoon was pinned, that the flank had to move, that the bunker had to be reached. That waiting might cost more lives. In war, belief is often stripped down to its smallest form. Not ideology, not strategy, not speeches, just the next movement. The next decision, the next few yards of ground. What really happened on Peleliu was that all the larger beliefs were tested by reality. The island did not fall quickly. The bombardment did not erase the defense. The airfield did not end the battle. The Japanese fortifications did not prove untouchable. Courage did not make the cost disappear. Victory did not feel clean. And in the southern sector, on September 18, 1944, one Marine exposed the weakness inside a system designed to seem unbreakable. Jackson's attack did not make him invincible. It made him close. That was the difference. Close enough to fire into openings. Close enough to throw grenades and use explosive charges. Close enough to turn fortified protection into confinement. Close enough to change the immediate fate of his platoon's left flank. The official record says he destroyed 12 pillboxes and killed about 50 Japanese soldiers. But the deeper truth is not only in the count. It is in the reversal. They believed the bunker made them untouchable. What really happened was that the bunker became a trap once the attacker reached its mouth. They believed the Marine advance could be frozen. What really happened was that one man's decision restored movement. They believed Peleliu would obey their plans. What really happened was that Peleliu obeyed only the cruel logic of terrain, fire, endurance, and sacrifice. This is why the story endures. Not because it is easy to tell, but because it is hard to fully understand. It forces us to hold several truths at once. Arthur Jackson's courage was extraordinary. The battle that required such courage was devastating. The Japanese defense was tactically formidable. The men inside those defenses were doomed by a war that had already consumed millions. The Marines who destroyed them were not untouched by the destruction. They carried it forward. Picture the final image. The smoke begins to lift over coral ground. The pillboxes that had stopped the advance are shattered. The air is still hot. The Marines who survived do not look like men in a victory parade. They look exhausted, filthy, stunned by the fact that they are still alive. Somewhere nearby, Arthur Jackson stands in the aftermath of what he has done, not yet a legend, not yet a Medal of Honor recipient, just a young Marine on a small island that has demanded too much from everyone. The battlefield has moved, but it has not healed. That is the truth behind the myth. When people repeat the story as one American against dozens of Japanese soldiers, they often focus on the impossible violence of the moment. But the real question is not only how he survived. The real question is what kind of battlefield creates such a moment in the first place. What did Peleliu demand from the men who fought there? What did it take from them? And what did it reveal about war when belief finally collided with reality? On Peleliu, the answer was written in coral, smoke, silence, and blood. They believed the island could be mastered. What really happened was that the island mastered them first.